Good morning, everybody. Hi.
Richard, so it's a strange world, the book world. How on earth did you get into it?
Well, it's very interesting. I grew up with my father was a great collector of books from an early age, and he was passionate about the natural world. He was a very keen ornithologist and bird watcher, and so he collected books about birds. But his particular passion was books with hand-colored illustrations from the 18th and 19th century, predominantly. Before the time of color printing came along, if you wanted illustrations in color in a book, the only way to do that was laboriously having them hand painted in these folio volumes. So I grew up with lovely books at home. Myself, I read English at university, so I was really into English literature, the rise of the novel in the 18th century. And I thought, what am I going to do? I was interested in getting into rare books, the book world. Did I go and work for a bookseller, perhaps? And I thought, well, perhaps the best thing is to go and work in an auction house, because you get to see lots of books, get into fantastic collections and see them for yourself. So in September 1999, I started as an intern at Sotheby's auctioneers in London, who have been selling books for 250 years or more. And it was their foundation department. So there's a large range of specialists there, 16 covering every type of book and manuscript you can imagine. And it was a thrilling experience for me. And I was there as a junior cataloguer to begin with, cataloguing all the lower value books under sort of £3,000. But I would be cataloguing books printed in the 1500s right up to modern first editions. And when I started, Sotheby's didn't even have a website. That didn't start till January 2000. And so that was a big change in the whole book collecting market, that instead of, having to visit bookshops or go and visit an auction in person, you could actually bid online on the internet, which was revolutionary. This is an illustration by the great 18th century caricaturist Thomas Rowlandson, showing a book auction at Sotheby's back in the 18th century. There's the auctioneer with his gavel. Behind him, there's a double hemisphere world map, probably by Blau or somebody. And you can see in the foreground, there's one of the porters or technicians, as they're called today, holding open a book. And all the book dealers are sitting around in this horseshoe-shaped table, which was known as the ring. So this is where you get the historical auctioneer's ring from, where all the book trade would be there, or the dealers of whatever type of property is being sold. And in the old days, they used to sort of ring the auction to try and get the property for the lowest possible price they could. Of course, that doesn't happen nowadays, but that's what an auction looked like. And it hasn't really changed very much since then, except the books aren't held up. They're all on a digital screen now. And a lot of books are now sold online. So you don't often get rooms as full as this, except for the sale last summer, which we'll come on to later, of Charlie Watts's library. That was an absolute packed room of bidders. But I think to understand, where we are with books today, we sort of go back to the beginning of what makes a book valuable. And before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, everything had to be done by hand. There was no printing press. So here we have a monk sitting in his cell, laboriously copying out a book by hand. And so books at this period before the 15th century were very expensive luxury items, only afforded by the very rich, very wealthy, who could afford to have a book. It was his writing with a quill pen. That's where you get the word penknife from, because he'd be trimming the quill of his the quill to write the manuscript. And it was often written on vellum, on calf skin. That's a very durable material. And they would illuminate them with coloured illustrations, heightened with gold as well. So these were really luxurious objects.
Were these mainly, sorry to interject there, Richard, were these mainly for private customers, ecclesiastical customers? Were they kind of across the board in terms of, obviously you had to be very rich to purchase a book.
Very much so, yes. So these were commissioned. Really, monasteries were the seats of learning in the Middle Ages. They had the scriptoriums, the people who were educated, who could write and read Latin. They could read Greek and other ancient languages. and they would copy them out. So if you wanted a copy of a book, you couldn't ask for one to be printed on demand. You had to commission a scribe to actually laboriously write out another copy, and they had to be very careful to make sure that things were written correctly. I mean, famously, when printing came along, errors were made in Bibles, and the mistakes do happen. Sometimes they're very famous examples of books which do contain errors in them. There's a famous Bible called the Wicked Bible, where a printer forgot the not in one of the 10 Commandments, and thou shalt not commit adultery. So that was pulped. Few copies survive, and if those come up for sale nowadays, they can fetch tens of thousands of pounds as a result. This is an example of a 14th century book that's been entirely produced by hand, beautifully illustrated with these pictures, hand painted, and a lot of the materials were very valuable as well. To get this rich blue, that's made from crushed lapis lazuli, and the only place in the world at the time where you could get that was from Afghanistan. It was traded by Venetian merchants, so printers would have to travel to Venice to go and buy this lapis lazuli, which, you know, gram for gram was more valuable than gold. So they were luxurious products, and often they're religious books. They're often Bibles or books by the church fathers. So a lot of them are religious. If you get secular texts and histories, they tend to be much more scarce, and if they do come on the market again, they command premium prices. So these were really the luxury objects of their days. You know, it wasn't the Ferrari, the Rolex watch. Status symbols like this was to have a few books in your library. If you had books, really, you were either aristocrat, you were a very wealthy individual, or you were a member of the church, and the church had a lot of these books. At the time of the Reformation, a lot of these books came out of the great monastic libraries, certainly in England, and were dispersed. And they do turn up for sale from time to time. So the next image we have is the Gutenberg Bible. This is probably the most famous printed book in the world, because it was printed on the newly invented printing press in Germany by a man called Johannes Gutenberg in 1455. And this is the first book printed with movable type. So what makes it absolutely extraordinary is that he created each individual letter of the alphabet. He had to produce a piece of type and hand set each page. So it took him several years to produce. It looks like an illuminated manuscript because that is what people knew, and that's what they were familiar with. And even the decoration has been added by hand. A lot of the initial letters were hand painted as well. But the black text you see there is the first time that people have seen a printed book.
So how did they decide, Richard, on a typeface, a font? Was it, obviously you've got quite an old Gothic kind of style here, but
yes,
how did they come up with that? And was there kind of like a uniform kind of agreement that they would print in this format, or?
No, he was a independent printer. He based his type on the traditional Gothic writing that was prevalent in Germany in the 15th century. And it's believed that he printed over about 180 copies of this book were printed, of which today around 49 copies still survive.
Gosh.
A complete copy of this book hasn't appeared at auction since 1978. And the last copy, it's in 2 volumes, made $2 million back in 1978. A single volume sold, I think volume 1 only sold in 1987. That made just under $5 million. And if a copy was to appear on the market today, it would be worth tens of millions of dollars.
Gosh.
There are a few in private hands, and maybe one day in our lifetime, one of those copies may appear at auction again.
Gosh, what a thing! Not something to take on holiday, no doubt. It's a lovely thing, isn't it?
So this is a book from the 15th century, and any book printed before 1500 is called an incunabula, and it means the cradle of printing. So this is the infancy of printing, really, in the late 1500s. So if you ask what makes a book valuable, any book printed before 1500 is going to be valuable purely because of its age.
Okay.
There are plenty of books that are old that are worth very little money at all, but any book printed before 1500 will be valuable purely for the fact that it's in the first 50 years of printing. So then we move on to 16th century, if there's a Vesalius, and in 1543 was a golden age. Here we have a book, one of the most important anatomical books ever created by the Flemish physician called Andreas Vesalius, and he was fascinated with human anatomy. So he was studying the human body, and he was doing it through dissection. Previously, a lot of people hadn't been able to use bodies for the purpose of dissection. The church was against it, so a lot of people had to guess. And for the first time, this was a scientific book produced by his own scientific researchers of anatomy. And what's special about this particular copy is the annotations. On the right-hand side, you can see this manuscript notes. Now, this copy surfaced in 2007 in an auction in Germany, and it sold for 15,000 euros. Last month, this very copy sold at Christie's in London for $1.8 million, and it was bought by the university in Belgium and by the Flemish community. Now, the reason it made so much money compared to when it last sold in 2007 is that since then, the person who bought the book did a lot of research on the annotations, because there's a lot of crossings out and notes in the book, and discovered that these notes were actually written by Vesalius himself.
Gosh.
And so
were they corrections then, or was he things that he wished he'd written? Or yeah.
Yes, this was a second edition of the book, and he was busy correcting this very copy to produce a third edition with his latest notes and thoughts about his latest anatomical researches. So as a result of that, he died before the third edition was published. So what this copy tells us is all of his latest understanding of human anatomy up to that point for an unpublished third edition. So the third edition never came. This is as close as you could get to his latest knowledge and understanding. There's over 1,000 manuscript notes and crossings out and corrections, improvements to some of the anatomical drawings in the book. And so it was an extraordinary price, really. It had been estimated at 800 to 1.2 million. And so that's now a world record price for a scientific book.
And I suppose this was a period as well, Richard, when obviously the illustration on there, you've got an engraving that's obviously been printed, but this was a point in time where engravings were becoming more prominent in terms of the art world. So this is a similar kind of period whereby you were having text and illustrations as well.
Very much so, yes. And I think if we go on to the next image of Copernicus, 1543 was obviously a golden year, because while Vesalius was looking at the human body, the famous scientist Nicholas Copernicus was looking at celestial bodies. And this is another extraordinary book. And what it shows here, for the very first time, when all sort of human history, we've been thinking that, everything revolves around the Earth, all the planets, the solar system, we're looking at an Earth-centric solar system. And Copernicus said no. And for the first time in print in this book in 1543, he promoted the idea of a heliocentric universe. That is, that all the planetary bodies rotate around the sun, and the sun is the center of the universe. And so this is an absolute landmark book in the history of printing for the very first time, and it's illustrated as well. And a copy of this, should it appear at auction, would now sell for between 700 and 900,000 pounds if you have a copy. So
this is one of the first times, I suppose, that many people, I mean, you can explain so much with words, but with an illustration of dictating how the solar system works, in effect, will be the first time that anyone really had any clue. I mean, it's hard to imagine, really, I imagine, Richard, when we have such a media-centric world now, where everything is available on tap, that these people, they would be their first interpretation of how this type of thing would work from a book.
Absolutely. So this is revolutionary. And the wonderful thing about the printing press that Gutenberg invented in the mid-15th century was that the dissemination of knowledge and information, ideas. And even today, we're still benefiting from that invention of the printing press. Although much media is published online, we still have books out there. People still read magazines, newspapers, and it all stems back to this being able to publish new ideas. And instead of having to handwrite a copy of every text again, suddenly you can have hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of copies of the same information disseminating very quickly and leading to new scientific discoveries. I think if we fast forward to the 19th century, to Darwin, still on the theme of science, this is another great landmark in the history of science that people collect. Charles Darwin, this book, which is On the Origin of Species, the first time discussing about the evolution. And this is a copy as you would have received it from the publisher in the original green cloth. Many copies. Cloth isn't a very durable material, unlike leather bindings, and so many copies you'll see of this book would have been rebound into a leather binding. And so if you get a copy like this in the original cloth, you'll be looking at something like around about sort of £100,000 now for first edition of Darwin's Origin of Species.
Which for a book that is, I mean, to be fair, very widely known and
yes.
and was not an instant success, but pretty much a success. It's condition, isn't it, really, Richard? And it's an original form that is just plays such a vital part.
I think that's it. It's very interesting for collectors, and we'll come on to an image in a minute, showing what people are looking for. I think book collectors want to have things in the earliest possible state that it was issued by the printer or the publisher, and this is a classic example. It's not a rare book. Thousands of copies were printed, but to get one really pristine in the original cloth is very valuable. And on Wednesday this week, Bonhams are offering an inscribed presentation copy of this book, which has been estimated at £150,000 to £250,000. So it'll be interesting to see what that copy makes, because obviously a copy that's been held by the author gives another added layer of interest, because that Darwin would have held that copy in his hand. He's presented it to a fellow friend and scientist, and so that adds another level of interest for a collector. I think we go on to the next book. So we'll look at some English literature, for example. Yeah, just one before that, this one. So printing came to England quite late. Gutenberg had been printing his Bible in 1455. The first English printer was a man called William Caxton, who set up a printing press in Bruges. And so the first book printed in English was a book on the history of Troy, which was printed in Bruges in 1473. But the first book in English printed in England wasn't until 1476, and this is a copy of it. This is the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. The last copy, this copy actually sold at auction in 1997, and when it was sold, it became the most valuable printed book ever sold when it sold for £4.3 million at auction. And today, this copy is held in an English private collection. And if it came on the market now, it would be worth somewhere between 10 and 15 million pounds if that was sold. So this is the very start of literature in English and printing books in English in England.
I would imagine, Richard, that in terms of languages now, is English the most printed language?
I think probably is based really on the dominance, prevalence of English on the internet. Mm-hmm. And also with the number of Bibles, for example, which is the most published book. They estimate between 5 and 7 billion Bibles have been printed over the last 600 years. So if we skip to the next image of Great English, doesn't look very much, these volumes, but it's exactly as the book would have come from the printer. This is a first edition of a book by Jane Austen. And they always say, don't judge a book by its cover. And this is a classic example that a lot of books, you hold them up and you can't really tell what it is, or if it's an interesting book on science, or if it's an interesting early book of English literature, until you open it. So books really have to be held. They're portable objects. They're meant to be engaged with by opening them and looking at them. So if you saw these 3 volumes high up on a shelf in an English country house library, you might dismiss them. But if I saw that on a shelf in a country house, I'd be going for them. And you could see it's a triple decker. It was published in 3 volumes, Pride and Prejudice, And it's very, very rare to have it like this, because most copies, you would go to your bookbinder and have it bound up as you would have your other books bound up in a nice sort of red leather binding, perhaps, or to match the other books in your collection. But this is as that book came straight out of the printing shop. So that is something that's very, very special. And a copy of that now, you would be looking, that copy sold in 2010 for about £115,000. If you had a rebound copy, it's about half the price. So collectors pay a real premium to have books in the earliest possible state that you could imagine. You know, moving on to the 20th century, and dust jackets, because really the dust jacket came in the 19th century, and it was literally that, a dust wrapper to throw away. It protected the book from the printer to the person who was buying the book, and then you would throw away the wrapper of the book. But in the 20th century, the paper wrapper became everything, and it was all about the design and the collectability of these wrappers. A lot of early dust wrappers were thrown away by people, sometimes because they had the price on the spine, and people didn't like having a book on the shelf with the price of how much they'd paid for the book visible to everybody, so you'd throw away the wrapper. And it was the book that mattered. But now these iconic images, dust jackets, such as Ian Fleming's book, first published in 1953, Casino Royale, which introduced the world to the legendary 007. In a dust jacket, that book is worth about £20,000 at auction. Without the dust jacket, it's worth about £2,000. So that piece of paper, which isn't a banknote, it's not security printed, can add huge amounts of money to the value of first editions. And if we move on to next book, which is this one, Octopussy, famous, was the last book by Ian Fleming, printed in 1966. So you have the first book, 1953, £20,000. Octopussy, you can pick up a copy for about £200, because the rarest book of any author is always going to be their very first book. When they're an unknown author, the publisher doesn't want to print thousands of copies, because if it's a flop, they've wasted all that money printing copies. So Casino Royale, probably about 1,000 first editions. Octopussy, it was a printing of about 20,000 copies. So it's all about supply and demand in the collector's market. And then if we skip on to the next image, I'm sure this is a book which many of you are very familiar with. You may have grown up reading it, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, published in 1997. So it was just 2 years out when I started my career in rare books. And already by then, by 1999, it had already become sort of a legendary book in the world. Now, this is an absolutely pristine copy. You can see sometimes the spine is faded. People keep them on the shelves. And what's interesting about this is it never had a dust jacket. So this is the first Harry Potter book by Rowling was issued without a dust jacket. So if you don't have a dust jacket, that's exactly as it should be. All the others were issued with dust jackets.
They seem to come up quite regularly, don't they?
They do. There were 500 copies printed of that, which isn't very much, because Bloomsbury, who was an untested author, nobody knew how it was going to sell. It won the Smarties Prize soon after it came out, and the cover changed. I don't think really liked the wizard on the back, so that was redrawn as well. And it also came out in paperback. So in fact, there are two versions of this book in the first edition, first issue, one in hardback and the paperback issue as well. So textually inside they are identical, except for the fact one's in soft wrappers and one was in boards. A copy like this in boards now can make anything between £50,000 to £100,000, depending on the condition. And so it's all about condition, and collectors who have these now tend to buy or ask somebody to make a specially commissioned box to keep them in mint condition, stop them from fading. And they may have another copy, a reading copy, but the collector's copy they will keep very carefully in a box.
But the fascination with Harry Potter carried on, because even the later books in first editions, not obviously worth as much, but are still collectible, aren't they?
Very much so. Although the last book in the series, there were 10 million first editions printed by Bloomsbury. So that's a book you can pick up now for a few pounds. You can have a first edition of that one. The Goblet of Fire was 1 million copies, but only 500 of this. And a lot of them were given to schools. So were read to death, and they survive in very poor condition.
You hear of them coming up at libraries, don't you, and things like that?
A lot of them have library stamps all over them, and even the ones covered in library stamps, very worn condition, can still make, you know, thousands of pounds when they come up for sale. Famously, somebody had a copy of the first paperback edition that was absolutely in almost shredded state, and the girl who owned it went up to J.K. Rowling once at one of the events and got her to inscribe it, and she wrote a wonderful note in that copy. She said, "This is how I love to see my books."
Oh, isn't that great?
Well read.
Brilliant, yes.
And enjoyed by readers. And then I think she put it up for sale. And because of that inscription, if it hadn't had that inscription, it may have sold for £500. With that inscription, it sold for £16,000. So
inscriptions are the thing. We'll come on to that later.
That's something really important, I think, as well, to have that note that transformed it from being a tatty first edition in the paperback to an iconic book with a message by the author inside it that made it really very special indeed. I'm realizing that the time issue, so perhaps we'll skip some of the illustrations and we'll go on to some other modern first editions that I was dealing with last year. Agatha Christie and the 13 Problems. So these are all natural history books, maps, atlases, people collect.
And these are, I hate to say it, that they're not going to come up all the time, but I think for our broker colleagues and things like that, and if they're going out and talking to people, there is a tendency that, you know, these 20th century books are possibly more prominent in people's homes than maybe the older books. Would you say, Richard?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the older books you'll find in English country house libraries. You'll find them in sort of historic collections. And there's nothing I love more than going around an old country house library and discovering treasures they don't even know that the present owners are not aware of. Last year, I discovered folded up in a shoebox in somebody's archive, a very rare map of Greece printed in the 18th century. That's one of only 23 copies known in the world. And I said, well, it's worth about £60,000 if that came on the market, and they were thrilled because it helps pay for some of the roof repairs that they had. And another library, I discovered a first edition of Isaac Newton's book on calculus, a copy of which had sold the previous year for £126,000. So the discoveries are to be made, but most people in most houses you go to, you're not going to find those sorts of great sort of scientific or travel books, but you're more likely to possibly come across maybe a first edition of Agatha Christie. Now, last summer, the Rolling Stone, Charlie Watts, who was the drummer for the Rolling Stones, he died a couple of years ago, and he, towards later in life, actually, in the while he was in his 60s, he was walking past a bookshop in London, popped in, and picked up a copy of P.G. Wodehouse for £100. He thought that was a fun thing to collect, and he sort of went back and over the successive weeks, he started collecting modern first editions from his childhood, growing up in the 40s. He loved that golden age of the jazz world that he was immersed in, but he also had a great fascination with detective fiction and with American literature as well. So he had probably the best collection of Agatha Christie books that have ever come onto the market. And this is a copy of Agatha Christie's famous book, The 13 Problems. There are only a handful of copies known in a dust jacket because people threw away the dust jackets. And it's got the price on the spine. People didn't like having books with the price on them as well, especially you give it as a present to somebody at the time. You know, people would price clip. So this copy made a world record, £48,000, because it was the finest copy of that book. You can see there's barely any damage or tears to the jacket. It's pristine condition.
When you look at a book like that, Richard, that comes from a library of, a celebrity, shall we say, what difference does it make coming from a celebrity as opposed to just from a normal library?
Well, I think any collection of books that comes to the market that's a single owner collection, as it was with Charlie Watts's library, people love the fact, the ownership, the history, and provenance. It's like, who's owned these things before? Does that add something? And certainly, it's a story. Collectors love telling stories about. They love to show off what they've collected. Whether it's Japanese Netsuke or if it's modern first editions of detective fiction, and they like to tell stories. And so if you can say, I've got this great book, I've got a first edition of Agatha Christie's 30, wow, that's fantastic, and it was owned by the drummer of the Rolling Stones, and people go, how fantastic is that? So you've got all these added layers of interest in storytelling, like that the girl who I think if she could have kept that book from J.K. Rowling, I would have kept that. I mean, it's just really special to have a book that an author's engaged with. This wasn't signed, but a lot of Charlie's Agatha Christie's books had come from the collection of Agatha Christie's secretary and amanuensis, Charlotte Carlo Fisher. And she worked for Agatha Christie's from the mid-1920s. And every time Agatha wrote a new book, she would inscribe her latest book to Carlo Fisher. And she had a complete collection of over 80 of Agatha Christie's titles, each one inscribed to her by Agatha Christie. Unfortunately, she also threw away the dust jacket each time she got one on the shelf. So she didn't like the dust jacket. She threw them away, and she loved the bright orange colours of the spines of the cloth, of the original cloth. Now, unfortunately, that probably depreciated the value by about 80%. If they'd had the dust jackets, she'd kept those, they'd have been worth 100 times more. But what Charlie Watts did when he acquired these books, which were inscribed, he would get other copies with a first edition dust jacket and then take the jacket off that book and add it to his copy. So he improved the copies. Now you can say, well, that's not the original jacket for that copy, but if you want to do that, it's up to you. It's your personal decision if you're going to improve a copy. And to be fair, in the catalogue, each copy was described saying supplied dust jacket from another copy. So it was an original dust jacket, but it came from another first edition because unfortunately, Carlo had thrown the others away. And then,
I was going to say, I think one of the other books I think we're coming to at the moment is possibly one of the best books I've seen of all time from Charlie's collection.
Yes, let's move on to the next one, Steve. If you've got another image. Here we are. The Great Gatsby, one of the great books of the golden age, American fiction literature, this iconic dust jacket. And it's got a bit of wear and tear to it. This is an uninscribed copy that was owned by Charlie Watts. And very interestingly, he had two copies. Well, he had three. He had a reading copy, collecting copies. This was a copy in dust jacket, not inscribed by Fitzgerald. And with the dust jacket, that made £100,000 in the sale last year. The next copy, if we move on to the next image, is the second copy he owned, lacking its dust jacket, but with the greatest inscription you could ever want of this book. That's written by Scott Fitzgerald for his friend Harold Goldman, the original Gatsby of this story, with thanks for letting me reveal these secrets of his part.
I mean, I went to I was very, very lucky to be invited to the Christie's sale for this because I've worked with the Stones before, and honestly, just seeing that, it's the most glorious thing you can ever imagine. I mean, owning the book that was dedicated to the Gatsby, it's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yes, and for that reason, this is a book that's worth probably now £200,000 because of that authorial inscription. With a dust jacket, you could probably add another 50,000 to it. But it's interesting that Charlie chose on this particular copy not to move the dust jacket from the other copy to this one, and it is what it is now. But this is so there's so many different elements that make books rare, interesting, collectible, valuable. Is it the first time an idea was printed, like the Copernicus, like the Vesalius, for example? Is it a book that somebody's written in, a presentation copy by Darwin or a presentation copy by Scott Fitzgerald. Another copy, if we move on to the next book, was another copy that was inscribed, also owned by Charlie Watson, sold last summer. And this is The Hound of the Baskervilles, the great adventure by Sherlock Holmes, by Conan Doyle. And it's inscribed by Conan Doyle. It's the only known presentation copy of The Hound of the Baskervilles. And it writes he's written on the title page, I perambulated across Dartmoor before I wrote this book. So, written about Dartmoor, The Hound of the Baskervilles there, and he'd actually walked on Dartmoor, putting his ideas together in his mind before sitting down and writing this book. So if you are a Sherlock Holmes fan, lots of Sherlock, and you love The Hound of the Baskervilles, this is the ultimate copy of the book that you could possibly have. And it was in pristine cloth condition, and there was a huge bidding war for this copy, and estimated at £70,000. It ended up selling for over £170,000 last summer. And we can see the outside of the book in the next illustration. And I think this had a particular appeal for Charlie Watts because his house was just 15 miles north of Dartmoor in Devon. So for him, it would have had a particular association as well. It was geographically near where he lived. He loved Conan Doyle's stories as well, loved the Sherlock Holmes tales. And it's just, what a fantastic, again, this is just a beautiful book. I love the Victorian design on the binding with the hound there, the gilt illustrations, the gilt binding as well. So some people collect books purely for the look of them. And if you want to collect books purely for their decoration and design, you can build a very affordable collection of books on whatever subject you're interested in. And that's the wonderful thing about book collecting. Every subject you can think of, every thing that's been considered or thought of or put to pen and paper, there will be a book on that subject. My wife, for example, she's a big fan. She loves cookery, and she wants to have a cookery book from every country in the world. Now, she goes through charity shops finding those, and she doesn't like spending more than about £5. And most copies she's bought up for £1 or £2. But now we've got a bookcase just full of these wonderful cookery books, which she uses. And so you don't have to spend a lot of money building a collection that can mean something special to you. Obviously, if you're a multimillionaire celebrity, you can afford to buy these wonderful inscribed copies of great novels of the 20th century. Or you might collect travel books, or you might like maps and atlases showing how the world has been projected over the last 600 years in maps. So really, it's a fascinating area of collecting. And I'm sure that although perhaps fewer books are being printed today, there will still be collector's market for this. And I think J.K. Rowling's a case in point. Her books have been published in such a wide variety of formats that adult covers, because adults were reading the books and they're embarrassed reading a book, apparently a children's book, so they Bloomsbury published copies with adult covers on them, and those are collectible. And then they produced limited editions with gilt edging and ribbon markers. So really, I think Bloomsbury have sort of fed into this. They realized that there were collectors out there who want these books, and they're feeding that demand. So I hope that's given you
it's a fascinating world. And I'm aware we're running a little bit short on time, but I'm sure there's going to be a few questions from the floor. So if anyone would like to ask some questions to Richard. Come on, Steve, you've usually got a few.
Well, just that the Great Gatsby put a shiver down my spine when I saw that. I mean, that's just quite incredible. And you've given us some really good ideas of things to look. When we talk to clients, we've got a section in our fact find for books to put the sum insured in, but we often concentrate on the jewellery, the pictures of the paintings and the antiques. And this has shown me that we really need to be asking a few more questions about books that the client might have when they last maybe had them valued, if they have got an older property with big old library.
I think certainly with inherited books, the people I've been to so many houses and I say, do you know what you have? And they go, no. They
Yeah.
walls of books, it's furniture, it's book decoration. They have no idea what they have on their shelves. They never read them, never look at them. If it's somebody who's actually been actively collecting books, people who went to go and visit Charlie Watts, he knew every single book in his collection, knew what he'd paid for it, knew the interest, could tell you stories about every single book and where he'd found it, in the little bookshop or online or speaking to a bookseller. So it's very different if you're speaking to a collector who's actually put a collection together. They will know the value of their collection. But if somebody's inherited a few books, they may not know that these books have any value at all. And sometimes books have often been saved from the skip by somebody who just thought, oh, it's a nice thing. And then they suddenly realize that actually it's a very valuable, rare edition of Jane Austen or first edition of Charles Darwin.
Linda, what was your question?
It was just a question about a book that I loved when I was in school. We did Wuthering Heights and I absolutely loved it. And I was just wondering, was there many first editions of Wuthering Heights and would they be quite valuable?
They're very valuable. Wuthering Heights, it's one of the rarest of the Bronte's books. And it was issued in not very many numbers. And a copy now is going to be worth upwards of £200,000 if a first edition of Wuthering Heights came on the market. The Brontes have a continued appeal. There was a collector in the late 19th century called Alfred Law, who put together probably one of the finest collections of English literature. And 3 years ago, that library was going to be sold on the open market at auction. And it was recognized to be so important, having all these great works of literature in there by Jane Austen, by the Bronte sisters, that the Friends of the National Libraries clubbed together with a lot of UK libraries, the British Library, the Bronte Museum, the Bronte Parsonage Museum, Jane Austen's house at Chawton, and they saved this library for the nation. It cost them £15 million. Half of which money was put up by a single benefactor called Leonard Blavatnik. So that library's been saved for the nation. And in that collection, there were these fantastic little miniature books written by the Bronte sisters as children. They wrote short stories, imaginary stories for their toy soldiers. And if you look at them, they're the size of, maybe twice the size of a postage stamp, miniature books with absolutely microscopic handwriting in them, these stories. And there were 3 of those in the collection, each one of which would be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds if it was sold on the open market. And they've all been saved now. They have an exhibition at the Bronte Parsonage Museum in Haworth in Yorkshire. And the wonderful thing about that library is it was dispersed across the country. So lots of public libraries took part. The Brotherton Library in Leeds, as I said, Jane Austen's house, the British Library, the Bodleian Library, National Library of Scotland. So those treasures, and if you search for Honresfield Blavatnik Library online, you'll see a lot of the treasures from that collection, which includes these wonderful books by the Bronte sisters, including their copy of a book by Thomas Bewick, who was an illustrator in the late 18th century about birds. And they've written all these notes about all the birds in the copy of the book. So really, that was a library full of treasures. But the Brontes have an enduring appeal, like Jane Austen. And
I was going to ask, actually, Richard, just to interject on that. Do you think that, obviously, Bronte kind of things, Austen things, even Conan Doyle things, constantly updated with television programs and films, and there are so many different things now. Do you think the constant, not necessarily rehashing, but remaking of series and remaking of films draws more people into the original books and thinks, I loved that film, even the third or fourth incarnation of a film, I want the original book? Does that drive the prices up?
I think it does when films come out. And there are launches. You'd think that today, perhaps the Ian Fleming novels, would they stand the test of time? Would they still be collectible today? But the film franchise is so enormous that they keep throwing up new films, still keep being produced, and there's still that collector's demand. Perhaps people who, when they were younger, grew up with the films. Now some collectors now get to an age where they've got the money, they've got some disposable income. Let's start putting some books, diversifying my pension, perhaps put a little book collection together. Why not collect a set of novels of Ian Fleming, for example? I'll tell you a funny story. 10 years ago, I was doing a charity auction for London's Air Ambulance. One of the prizes that was offered was by Anthony Horowitz, which shows what the interest of the James Bond novels is, that he's still writing novels in the style of James Bond because there's still a demand. You know, Fleming wrote so many titles, but there's demand. People want more and more. And all the films they make now, they're new stories that have been developed either by Anthony Horowitz or other authors. And he put up the prize to be named in his next James Bond novel. And he said, well, I want someone to bid at least £5,000 for it. I was the charity auctioneer that evening, and there was some very wealthy city people in the audience, and we started the bidding at £4,000. People's hands shot up in the air, and at 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, and I could see two people on two tables on either side of the room really just wouldn't give up. And it went to 10,000, 11,000, 12,000. And then the bidding sort of slowed down a little bit. And I said, come so far, 13,000. And then the other person would think about it, 14,000. And then it got to 15,000. And the other person said, no, 15 would have been my limit as well. I'm not going any more than 15. So I had a bid of £15,000 for this character, which was a fantastic amount of money. To be named in a James Bond novel. You'd be immortalized in print forever to have your name in a novel. Anyway, Anthony Horowitz was there. So I quickly went over to his table. I said, look, Anthony, you've got two bidders here, both prepared to pay about £15,000. How about you put two names in your next novel, one for each? You have brilliant idea. Let's do it. So I went back up onto the stage and I said, right, you're both going to be in it at £15,000 each. So straight away, we doubled the money and we got £30,000 for the charity from those two bidders.
Bravo! Did they have good names though, Richard?
Yeah.
Well, one of the bidders was Nigel Ray, who was president of the Saracens, chairman of the Saracens rugby club, who donated it to a friend. In fact, he didn't want to be named. And the other was a man called Bernardo Herzog.
To be fair, that sounds like a Bond villain. So
it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Bernardo Herzog, yes, who's a Ferrari collector apparently. So he's down as James Bond's mechanic, and the book was published in September 2015 as Trigger Mortis. So you can see in the acknowledgements at the front that Anthony Horowitz mentions that two of the characters in this novel were due to a charitable donation for London's Air Ambulance.
How glorious, and what a fantastic story to end on. But Richard, this has been absolutely fascinating for me, and I hope it's been as fascinating for you guys who have joined us today. So thank you ever so much for joining us. It really has been fascinating. And Steve, thank you ever so much for having us once again.
Well, no, thank you very much for your time. That was fascinating. Could listen to you all day, I think. So I'll have to do it again.
Pleasure.
Well, thank you ever so much. And Richard, thank you very much. And we will see you very soon for the next one.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.